Hello, it's your friendly neighborhood host, JT Wheatley, back for another episode of the History Comics Podcast, this time with part 2 of the life of Carl Barks, the Good Duck artist. When we last left off, Carl Barks had just launched his comic book career, beginning to take over the Donald Duck stories, but he was about to truly take hold of the series when he envisioned him as an iconic character, Uncle Scrooge McDuck. In 1947, Carl Barks envisioned Scrooge McDuck, Donald Duck's rich but miserly uncle, in Christmas at Bear Mountain and Four Color Comics number 178 that December, followed by Gladstone Gander, Donald's obscenely lucky cousin, who happened to also be a goose, in Walt Disney Comics and Stories number 88 on January of 1948. Barks said Scrooge was originally created to serve as a Donald Duck story, but only for him to grow in popularity, rivaling Donald Duck himself, if not surpassing him. After all, it is Uncle Scrooge, not Donald Duck, who is the star of DuckTales. Barks made a point that Scrooge got his money legitimately through honest hard work, but claimed that he was an anti-capitalist as he just hoarded his money instead of investing and spending it, something Don Russo would correct in his run on the life and times of Scrooge McDuck. When asked, Carl Barks did state that the nephews Huey, Dewey, and Louie would inherit Uncle Scrooge's wealth, since Scrooge would trust they would know how to spend it well over Donald Duck, and this was even revealed in Walt Disney Comics and Stories number 155 in August of 1953. Barks had no doubt that they would put it to good use for the Junior Woodchucks, the Boy Scout-like organization Barks invented in Walt Disney Comics and Stories number 125, saving all those birds and whales. Plus, he was also inspired by Charles Dickens' character from A Christmas Carol. For Gladstone Gander, he was created by the need for Donald Duck to have a rival with great luck, as opposed to Donald's horrible luck. The Kneazles location was inspired by the Everglades, while Gyro Gearloose, Walt Disney Comics and Stories number 140 on May of 1952, came about for the need for an inventor to provide gadgets for both Scrooge and Donald. However, Barks would admit that its tall size made him awkward to draw on the panels. For all this, Barks was paid $11.50 a page for a script and $34 for art, claiming it was less work than superhero comics, but he still got a regular pension. However, his marriage with Clara was falling apart, resulting in a fight that at one point where she nearly destroyed much of his artwork. Despite all this, Carl Barks considered 1949 to be his best year of work, which has notable stories like Lost in the Andes, the classic Square Egg Tale, along with the In Old California, which he considered his personal favorite. Walt Disney Comics and Stories number 24 sold 1 million issues in September 1942, and by December of 1944 it sold 1.3 million, then 2 million in 1947, eventually reaching its highest number of 3,038,000 issues in 1953. Factor in that likely 2 to 4 people read each comic, that meant he had a readership as high as 12 million a month. Eventually it will be revealed the circulation of his comics reached 250 million people. In fact, his stories got so popular that on August 4th of 1950, Western Publishing decided to put more of his Donald Duck stories back into the monthly magazines, which Barks joked was a demotion, as it just meant more work. He preferred the long stories, as he found them easier to write and more fun to draw. Barks admitted he sometimes would go to local drugstores to see if the kids were buying his comics, but he never saw them do so. In the comics, Barks said he avoided politics, but he admitted to preferring to living in a free society. In 1950 to 51, Carl Barks produced Walt Disney's Comics and Stories with Donald Duck while his second marriage broke apart due to alcoholism. Nevertheless, he still paid for Clara's cancer bills and even designed an artificial leg for her when it had to be amputated, all the while moving out to a 2-room apartment with only his drawing board, some clothes, 2 blankets, and his National Geographic magazines. He would finally leave Clara in 1951, divorcing that December. Clara would eventually die from cirrhosis of the liver from 13 years later from her drinking, though he still paid her $250 in alimony per month till then. While in comics, he essentially created Duckburg and the entire universe surrounding the Donald Duck stories. Barks stated that Duckburg was a place that existed everywhere, similar to how Springfield in the Simpsons cartoon series does the same thing. Significantly, he created the Uncle Scrooge's iconic Money Swim in Walt Disney Comics and Stories number 124, which he does in his giant money bin that of all the money he's earned. The money swim resulted from a note from the editor Tom McKinnison, asked for a 10-page Donald Duck story for the February issue, along with a brief synopsis for his idea. Instead of getting a synopsis, Barks just gave him a fully produced story, resulting in it appearing in January issue because it came out so early. This also served to show how hard it was to control Barks or reduce his autonomy with the stories, along with a string of 10-page stories that represent some of his best work. The only downside was that Barks was actually paid less than other Western publishing artists, but it was something he gladly gave up for the freedom to tell his stories his own way. With his stories, Barks liked the reference history and mythology, using everything from Atlantis to the Flying Dutchman as inspiration, and of course, his National Geographic and Popular Science magazines. Other creations during this time were the Beagle Boys, Walt Disney Comics and Stories number 134 in November of 1951, a criminal family constantly trying to break into Uncle Scrooge's money bin, which Carl Barks also created. By that September of 1951, he completed the first full-length Uncle Scrooge story in 4-color comics number 386, and this would be the first of his 70 consecutive issues that would continue to 1966. The following year, he would be joined by Gar Williams, who began working on the backgrounds, and they would marry in July of 1954 in Reno, Nevada. In 1952, he created Cornelius Coote, the founder of Duckburg, Walt Disney Comics and Stories number 138, and then John D. Rockerduck in 1961, Walt Disney Comics and Stories number 255, another wealthy rival to Scrooge McDuck, and obviously modeled after oil tycoon John D. Rockefeller. Carl Barks' methods for crafting comics was writing a script out in longhand, breaking the plot down by panels, and then adding the dialogue. He used 2-ply Strathmore medium rough paper at 18 by 24 inches with a number 356 Easterbrook pen. Barks liked to stretch with a Scripto light blue pencil, inking the characters with his wife Gar, who inked the backgrounds and the dialogue. Barks preferred to only use color when needed. He would admit to reusing plots over the years while for reference. Carl Barks, of course, used his National Geographic magazines, which he was a lifelong subscriber from 1935 onward, the Encyclopedia Britannica, and Popular Science. Barks did admit to loving ghost towns, but never traveled abroad until the 1990s. For his stories, Barks assumed he was writing for 12 to 13-year-olds. One strange condition that Barks broke once was using humans in the Donald Duck stories, only later realizing it was weird when they appeared in the Dangerous Disguise story in one of the comics. However, Barks stated he drew his characters believing them to be human despite being ducks and dogs and so forth. He also couldn't use weird in the truest sense of the word due to the censorship at the times. Barks did make a point to have his stories done 6 to 8 months in advance. His work schedule was 1 p.m. to 10 p.m. His daughter Peggy would also provide story ideas. Barks said breaking down the story in the panels was drudgery, but that was where the best gags came from. Barks also praised the work of his past in animation, as it taught him how to keep a story tight. Barks admitted he rarely dealt with the censorship board, with the notable exception of the Klondike and the Trick or Treat story. Plus, he actually agreed with Dr. Frederick Werven, the author of The Seduction of Innocent, in the 1954 that attacked the comic book content. One thing Barks did enjoy was a great deal of autonomy, part of it due to his comic books being left alone by the overall Disney empire. Thus, Barks was able to write, pencil, ink, and letter his stories his way, rarely submitting synopses to Western publishing and instead being able to produce stories as he wanted, with little editorial or censorship changes. Carl Barks saw comics as freedom, especially from his past work in animation. That's not to say he didn't get some interference, especially early in his career, such as when editor Eleanor Packer preferred the original ending of his first long Donald Duck story, The Mummy's Ring, in 4-color comics number 29 in September of 1943, which was also the first long Donald Duck story Carl Barks wrote and drew. However, when Barks made the changes, Packer realized that the original was better and had him change it back. However, Barks also thought that comic books were a passing fad, which Western publishing also believed at the time, and they both thought it would just last for a few years. Boy, were they both wrong. Another bright spot in Carl Barks' life was marrying Margaret Winifred Williams, nicknamed Gar in 1954, whom he would stay married to her death. An accomplished landscape artist whose work appeared in the Leaning Tree Museum of Western Art, Barks would pay tribute to her by having a store named after her in his story Christmas in Duckburg on page 1 of Walt Disney's Christmas in the Parade number 9 on 1958. Despite all his hard work, few people knew Carl Barks was even the artist behind the Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge comic books, as Walt Disney Studios preferred to keep them anonymous. Walt Disney, at one point in the late 1940 suggested that artists like Carl Barks should be able to sign their own names to the comics, but the syndicate objected, believing readers believe Walt Disney actually did it. Interestingly enough, Carl Barks agreed with this policy and was even glad they didn't inform him of the numerous fan letters, as it would have distracted him from his work. Barks would have liked a few words of encouragement, though, from the editors based on the fan reaction, but he guessed if they didn't because it probably would have meant they would have to give him a raise as well. However, Barks got a glimpse of fame in 1955 when he was mentioned for the first time in the May issue of Fortnight, Volume 18, in an essay, The Comic World by Charles Beaumont, though Barks himself would deny published interviews until Walt Disney passed away in 1966, including the one by Malcolm Willits that he gave back in 1962, which wasn't published until 6 years later in Comic Art number 7. Barks continued to expand the Donald Duck universe, creating Flintheart Glomgold and Uncle Scrooge number 15 in February 1956, another wealthy rival and villain to Scrooge McDuck. Next, Barks invented Magica Dispel, a villainous witch, on April 17th of 1961 in the story The Midas Touch. Dispel was made to be Italian and beautiful, modeling her after the film actress Sophia Loren, and was meant to be a contrast to the old hag witches normally depicted at the time. Of all the characters he worked on, though, Barks said he loved Donald Duck the most, despite not being one of his original creations, seeing him as more the everyman that he and many others could relate to. Despite Disney Studios trying to keep the artist outside of Walt Disney anonymous, Carl Barks' fame continued to grow as fans started to actively seek him out in 1957. In 1961, Don and Maggie Thompson's fanzine, The Comic Art number 2, contained a letter with his name on it, showing the further cracks in Walt Disney's wall of silence. This would not concern Barks much, though, as sadly his daughter Peggy died of cervical cancer in 1963 at the age of 40, survived by her 3 children. That same year, Don and Maggie Thompson requested permission to reprint some of Carl Barks' art to go along with a Malcolm Willis interview of him in December of 1962. However, Disney denied him this, and the interview being published, still stating that children only want to believe that Walt Disney drew all the cartoons. Carl Barks would finally retire on June 30th, 1966, only to go on to produce Donald Duck-inspired oil paintings. In 1966, he was mentioned in the Comics World number 104, which, while he completed his final Donald Duck comic in Walt Disney Comics and Stories number 312 and Uncle Scrooge number 69, the final Uncle Scrooge story he would both write and draw. His final full story would be a Daisy Duck one in Walt Disney Digest number 5 in November 1968. He did receive 100 pages of original art as a retirement present from Charles Craig, the editor of Western Publishing, though most of it was destroyed to save space, since the company realized they could just use smaller photostats for reprints. Carl Barks, of course, didn't quite retire, as he would script and do layouts for 3 more comics, one more Uncle Scrooge and 2 more Donald Duck stories, where Barks was finally credited in Comic Art number 7, along with the critical essay The Lord of Quackley Hall by J. Michael Barrier. While this issue only achieved a circulation of 475 issues, it led to a flood of public acclaim inside and outside comic book circles to have Barks finally recognized. In 1969, Carl Barks moved to Goleta, California, and by 1971, he received his first Shazam Award for Best Writer, Humorist Division at the Disney Duckster Awards on the 26th of May. By 1974, Western Publishing was finally able to reveal the credits of the Disney comic book artist, with Carl Barks receiving more widespread acclaim as a result. By 1975, Carl Barks did his first video interview with Edward Sumner, and by 1976, Porky of the Mountains for the Overstreet Price Guide which is the cover he painted. It was Steve Gippy who came up with the Barkster Award, which Barks himself designed. In 1971, Carl Barks was awarded the Disney Duckster Award 5 years after his retirement and allowed to repaint oil paintings on commission of $150 to $350 apiece. He would produce 130 paintings over the next 5 years. His paintings took over 10 days to 3 weeks to complete, and of these, his favorite was an endorsement of Rick's. Also, he was the only person besides Walt Disney who could sign his name to a Disney painting. However, Barks couldn't keep up with the grind of the commissioned work, so he took up the suggestion of auctioning his paintings off instead for more money. Most notably of these was the July 4th in Duckburg, which sold at auction for $6,400. However, after Disney learned of the large sum Barks was now making, they promptly ended his right to make paintings. Due to his inability to create new paintings, the price of them increased in value, rising as high as $50,000. Barks would continue to do non-Disney paintings, such as kings and queens of myths